Okay, let's see. Hun, just let me know if you can hear me. I'm live now. Anyone else who's listening at the moment, just bear with me. I'm just verifying. Okay, cool. Everything's working. How's the echo? Okay, so good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's episode of Paranormal Encyclopedia. I gotta start with some bad news, unfortunately. As you may notice, this is not the studio. Um, the reality is, unfortunately, for those of you who aren't aware, doing a radio show in a live studio like that costs money. We get a very good deal from our from the station owner, but I just can't afford to keep doing a weekly show. I mean, the ads have not been panning out. Nobody's donated to the Patreon or the GoFundMe in ages. And the reality is, as much as I didn't want to do it, we've had to go back to this. It doesn't mean the end of the show. I'll be continuing to do this. I'm going to hopefully work on trying to get Chris and Brian back involved in some capacity because it really works better if it isn't just me. But for the time being, yes, stuck listening to me. Hopefully, you guys won't mind too much. Um, so that's the situation with the show. If you want to help, now I talked to the station owner, and we can get back on there. So if you want to help out, there are links in the description below. Um, that's patreon.com/paranormally, patreon.com/paranormally. Um, this also, by the way, means that the classes are on hold while I jigger some things around. Um, they're definitely not canceled. I just need to talk to some people and see what I can set up. But okay, enough depressing stuff. Let's get into tonight's topics. The first thing I want to address, and I've already beat this dead horse quite a bit, but it needs to be addressed again, particularly given this utter insanity is happening, as I understand it, tomorrow. So if you haven't seen it yet, I did a video on my channel called Kevin's Soapbox, which is part of a new series I'm going to be continuing here probably over this weekend, about where I'll just get off on religion, philosophy, current events, anything geeky I want to get into. So other things other than the obvious topics of the show. But the first one I did was to address this absolute insanity that has been planned to happen in, I want to say, Orlando. It's where the shooting at the gay nightclub happened last year. But a group called the NIFB, um, New International, New Independent Federation of Baptists, or something to that effect, which is led by a guy by the name of Stephen Anderson. Pastor Tom McMurtry's in there. With Matt Powell is in there. A whole bunch of other extremely radical Christians. Um, what now? I am, and you can listen to other shows I've done to back this up. Don't just take it at my word because I say I am. But I am a Christian, and I'm very much in favor of free speech. But these people are calling for violence. They're saying that the government should murder anyone who is in the LGBT plus community. That's not morally acceptable. That it's not Christian. You can go to the video, and I did a whole breakdown of why this is wrong. I would also suggest going to Mr. Atheist's channel. He's been kind of started the war against these people, leading to the absolute situation of Tommy McMurtry, the man who made the video promoting this evil event, called him a pumpkin because the pumpkin is the world's biggest fruit. And there's all debate going on, believe it, about whether or not pumpkins are the biggest fruit. But Mr. Atheist has embraced the title of being a pumpkin. Um, and if you look on a lot of atheists' feeds on Instagram and Twitter and things like that, you'll see pumpkins everywhere. And also, there's a particular line that's been going around, and I'm going to add my voice to it. I'm not saying that Pastor Tom McMurtry is sexually attracted to pumpkins. I'm just saying we don't really know. I'd also like to add that since Pastor McMurtry is also a young Earth creationist, and knowing these people's tactics, he'd probably demand, if somebody questioned the existence of God, he'd demand someone prove the non existence of God. I propose that he should prove that he is not attracted to pumpkins. Just saying. I also suggest going to TommyMcMurtry.com, which is not owned by or in any way affiliated with Tommy McMurtry. It was set up by Mr. Mr. Atheist as a clearinghouse of sexy, sexy pumpkins. Um, it's really quite nothing too not safe for work, but it is extremely fun. I do recommend checking it out. Um, but seriously, this is morally wrong. This is not acceptable. We should not be calling for people to be executed for their sexual attraction. And I don't know. I really find it baffling. I need to say this. Um, and we here at Paranormal Encyclopedia don't believe that. We believe I don't care. Unless you're a pedophile, I don't care what consenting adults do in their own bedrooms is their own business. I just hope, and my wish to my listeners and my followers is whoever you're with or not with, because there's people that just don't have that kind of attraction. I hope you find happiness and fulfillment for yourself. But let's get into tonight's topic. Oh, there is the one upside I did want to mention as well, of the whole we're not on the station anymore. The thing about being on the radio station was that we had to pay for the time, and also meant there was usually a show coming in after us. The upside of being at home is that I don't have to give up the mic to somebody else. I don't have to pay for my time. I can keep this mess going as long as I want. So tonight's topic, and we're not going to have ads at this point because we're reconfiguring our ad situation. But tonight's topic is going to be holy objects. I'll probably get into cursed objects and curses too, since we only briefly touched on that last week. Since the main focus of last week, of course, was torturing Chris horribly with hot wings. I'm extremely glad that we managed to do that while we still had the station. Granted, it would have been slightly easier here. But there has been an idea throughout history, even going back to ancient times before the Bible, certainly in the Bible itself, of objects that are blessed by God or the gods. Um, Various. Sometimes, for example, a lot in Greek mythology, you had this idea that the gods had special items associated with them. For example, Hades, the god of the dead, had a helm of darkness that he could put on and it would make him invisible. Um, there were Hermes sandals, which had wings, which would allow him to fly and move incredibly fast. Um, and gods would lend these items to mortals. Famous case in point, Perseus in the original legend when he goes off to fight the Minotaur, not the Minotaur, what am I saying? The Gorgon, Medusa specifically, because there are multiple Gorgons. He has sandals that were lent to him by Hermes. He has a highly reflective shield that was lent to him by Athena, and he has a sharp sword from Athena as well. Funny enough, in the original stories, no, he did not ride on Pegasus. That came in later with a guy by the name of Bellerophon. In fact, Pegasus was born from the slain neck of Medusa, because Greek mythology is weird. Well, thing in most mythology is weird, Christianity included. Probably the most famous example of a pre-Christian holy object is the Ark of the Covenant. Um, Although there are other ones, funny enough, and many of those are associated with the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark itself, most people know the story from Indiana Jones. It's the box that held the fragments of the Ten Commandments. Though granted, it was actually more than just the Ten Commandments. But it was carried around and lent power to the armies of Israel. If the famous story of the attack on the city of Jericho, people think of, well, they sounded the trumpets and the walls of Jericho fell. No. They marched around the city for days with the ark, and then at the end of, I want to say 7 days. Somebody who's better familiar with the Bible can feel free to correct me on that. But at the end of it, then they sounded the horns, and that brought the walls down. Um, Certainly, the Israelites thought the ark made them nearly invincible in battle, and granted, it was stolen on several occasions when they broke their covenant with God. Funny enough, this is what's interesting to me and a lot of other people about the ark is the general story mentioned in the Bible and elsewhere was only people only the priests could touch the ark, which of course would be an issue if we ever found it again because the tribe of the priests is long since disappeared. But despite the fact that there's stories even of people touching the ark and dying, being struck dead, even just to steady the ark, the various Egyptians and things like that came in and Babylonians was Egyptians and Babylonians. Man, my memory's terrible. Took the ark from the Israelites. It's like, well, wait, how did they carry it without dying? Um, Needless to say, the ark is in fact long since disappeared. I can neither confirm nor deny rumors that it is in a warehouse somewhere in the Midwest, possibly a warehouse named Warehouse 23 or 13. You never know. Um, and for those of you who are confused, Warehouse 13 is a TV show. Warehouse 23 is a role playing game supplement that was really the inspiration for the TV show, actually, written partly by one of the guests we had on recently, S. John Ross. But more seriously, here's the other thing. People mostly think of the Ark, and it's an incredibly important item, particularly relating to end times prophecy, and I'll come back around to that in a second. But there's a couple of other objects from the Old Testament that have a great deal of significance attached to them. Um, Another example would be the brazen serpent, which was a serpent made of brass. God instructed Moses to make to heal the Israelites. Um, and he raised it up, and they saw it, and they were healed. Another example of this would be the staff of Aaron. So here's a funny thing that a lot of people don't realize, particularly because a lot of movies kind of skip over it. Like I love the animated movie, The Prince of Egypt. But the Prince of Egypt gets this wrong. So we all know the iconic image of Moses standing before Pharaoh, staff into snake, turning the waters to blood, let my people go. Right? Here's the thing: it wasn't done by Moses. It was actually a lot of the miracles. Well, granted, it was done by God, but a lot of the miracles associated with that, the plagues and that, all of that, were actually done by Aaron. He's a very minor character in Prince of Egypt. Um, so Aaron's staff has also got a wide variety of legends around it. I've even heard legends that it was actually from the original Tree of Knowledge, or possibly the Tree of Life from the Garden of Eden, which is why it was imbued with these special abilities. Do I know any truth to that? No, I don't. But granted, in general, Jews and the Hebrews aren't big on giving talking about items having special ability powers. Certainly, and this is a common mistake a lot of non-Catholics make. The Jews did have holy water. Still do. The Bible talks about holy water and holy oil and things of that nature. That isn't something the Catholics just invented or took from the pagans. Excuse me. But generally speaking, they were very opposed to the idea of idolatry, the idea of worshiping an image or giving special credence to an image or an object. This became particularly important in Pontius Pilate's time leading Jerusalem because historically the Romans had had a rule that any Roman legion that was in the city of Jerusalem didn't carry its standards. They didn't put the shields up with its symbols, precisely because it would infuriate the Jews, who saw it as a form of idolatry. And then Pilate, immediately the moment he took over, just about changed all of that, and did in fact infuriate the Jews and provoke a number of uprisings, which got him in a lot of trouble with Rome. Um, but yeah, the Jews are very anti anything they consider a form of idolatry, which makes the Ark of the Covenant itself interesting because the Ark is supposed to be God's throne on earth. It nearly it takes on elements that, from an outsider's perspective, one might argue are idolatry. One thing I always find interesting, and like I said, the ark is important to end times prophecy. Why is the ark important to end times prophecy? Well, one of the most important things that both Christians and Jews believe has to happen for the Messiah to come. Well, come in the sense, in the case of the Jews, or return in the case of the Christians, is the rebuilding of the temple. The Temple of Solomon, which stood somewhere in modern day Palestine, Israel, most historians believe, although I've seen some debate about this as well, that it stood on what's known as the Temple Mount, which is a whole other issue with Islam. But to actually properly rebuild the temple and have it have the significance it had in the ancient world, it has to have the Ark of the Covenant in the central chamber, the Holy of Holies. The Ark of the Covenant, it's not really the full Temple of Solomon. This has led to endless speculation about where the Ark is, who's holding on to it, from the not unreasonable, like that the Catholic Church may have it stowed away somewhere, to the unlikely with secret cabals that are trying to rule the world, holding on to it, waiting for the right moment. There's also a church in Africa that claims to have the Ark of the Covenant. It's impossible to verify that claim because they keep it in a dark room and they only allow priests to enter that room once a year, in the general public, as archaeologists, historians, anyone who could verify the nature of the object, have never been allowed inside. Um, I, for the record, have no idea where the Ark of the Covenant is. If I did, I'd probably be more famous than I am now. That said, I do tend to think it's very likely the Catholic Church has it. We know, for example, that during the Middle Ages, the Knights of Templar did a lot of digging all over the Middle East and some other places. It doesn't seem to me unreasonable that they might have found it. And we know that the Knights were supposed to have had some sort of special treasure. Come to think of it, the Knights of Templar are another subject very much worth discussing at some point. That they had hid it in various strongholds um, that was never officially never found. It doesn't seem completely beyond the realm of possibility that the church did find it when the knights were hunted down and mostly destroyed in the 14th century. On the other hand, there's also the very real possibility that knights kept it. There are certain parts of Europe where church sway wasn't as powerful or full, um, particularly because the knights were destroyed less so by by the Catholic Church and more by King Philip IV of France, who was into them for a lot of money. And maybe if I peter out on the holy objects, I'll get into the knights a little as well, because they are actually pretty interesting. But in terms of Christianity, by far, the vast majority of holy objects are associated with with the life and the death of Christ. Some of these get weird. I gotta be honest with you. Probably the strangest of all of the objects I'm aware of associated with the life and death of Christ is there are churches, at least to my knowledge, two churches in the world that claim to have Christ's foreskin, which, of course, since he was a Jewish male, would have been removed from him shortly after his birth by a moil. But there are two separate foreskins, both credited as being Christ's. You can make of that what you will. I find it more than a little amusing, and the speculation that did he have a remarkable healing ability even at birth? Is that what? I don't. This is already getting far more awkward than I'm comfortable getting. So I think we'll leave it there. There's also, of course, pieces of the True Cross. There was a lively trade in these in the Middle Ages, and I've heard it said that they could probably have built several forests worth of true crosses out of all the pieces that are circulating in the world back then, and even to some extent now. Um, but there's the one that, of course, there's the one that everyone thinks of, and by far the most famous of the whole Christian holy objects, which would be the Holy Grail. Um, which of course we all will seek and cross the bridge of eternal peril, answer the questions three, and go to the castle of Arg. And if you don't understand that, just go watch Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Great movie. Um, but the story goes that when Jesus was crucified, okay, according to the Bible, when Jesus, before the crucifixion, Jesus sent his disciples into the city to find a place to hold a Passover feast, which is why we know that the crucifixion should have taken place around Passover. There's debate whether it was the feast at the beginning or the end or somewhere in between, but it was definitely some kind of Passover feast. And they eventually found a rich man by the name of Joseph of Arimathea who agreed to allow them to have it in his home. Jesus gathers them all together. He takes the bread, breaks it, said, "This is my body, eat of it." Then he takes wine. "This is my blood. Whoever drinks of it shall have eternal life." It gets passed around. This is where the Bible account of this Grail, or more properly in the earlier text, it would be the Holy Chalice, ends. We'll get to why it's more correct to call it the Holy Chalice. The Holy Chalice as the story progresses. And hi, one Yesus, and I apologize me if I butchered the pronunciation. Um, Thanks for joining us. So, anyway, the legend of the Grail goes on to say that Joseph of Arimathea brings it to the crucifixion, and we know from the biblical account, Christ is crucified. He says it is finished, and he dies. And there was a problem because traditionally, the Romans would break the legs of crucifixion victims so that the weight of their body would force them forward and eventually crush their chests and kill them. Um, but there are rules about breaking the legs of Christ. But the Jews were very upset because it was getting towards sunset, and in Judaism, um, Sabbath is Saturday, of course, as most people know probably. It's Saturday, but also in Judaism, days are from sunset to sunset. So it's coming on the end of the day. They don't want to have to spend their holy day preparing the body, getting it to the tomb, and all of that. So the demand is made, and finally a soldier traditionally named Longinus comes forward and strikes Christ's side with a spear. Um, the Bible tells us that when he does that, when he withdraws the spear, blood and water come out of the wound. Legend tells us that Joseph of Arimathea then catches this blood with the same cup that Jesus used for the Last Supper, and then travels to Europe with it. Now, here's the thing. First, the Bible doesn't mention him catching the blood. That comes over 1,000 years later. There's a progression to the story I'm telling, so be patient. There is a reason for this. But there's a rumor that you'll find in a number of religions, sects, religions, and even amongst atheists, that that the whole reason for that people saw Jesus after his death was he didn't die. The water that was offered to him on the sponge contained a poison that basically put him into a catatonic state. He survived the crucifixion, and then that made it very easy to fake his resurrection. The problem with this idea is really simple. If we're taking the account of the Gospels as accurate, and that's a whole other discussion. But if we're going by that, again, when he was struck in the side with the spear, blood and water came out. I know when I was young and I didn't know as much as I've learned since, I always thought, wait, why did water come out? Actually, even I originally thought it was just water, which is not what the Bible says, nor does it make any sense. But there is a specific type of wound to the chest that a person could take that would cause blood and water to run out of the wound, which is if the sac around your heart is pierced. The sac around your heart is pierced. There is water present. The water and blood could come out of the wound. That would explain what's going on. Why subsibber? One Y Subsibir? Am I getting that right? Or are you saying something else? I don't know. But so if the heart sac was pierced, that even if the crucifixion didn't kill him, that would have killed him. Um, does this prove conclusively that he rose from the dead? No, that's a whole other discussion for another day. Um, Realistically, that's not possible to objectively prove unless he physically turns up today and somehow proves it. I certainly believe that he did, but that's faith and belief, not something I can prove. Nor am I telling you that you need to. That's probably going to be the next soapbox. Is I'm going to sit down with everybody and explain to you why I'm personally a Christian, not in an attempt to convert the rest of you, just so you can get an idea of where I'm coming from. And okay, I don't speak Spanish, so I do apologize. Um, so getting back to the Grail, the story of the Grail kind of stops here for about 1,000 years, and it gets picked up by well, one second, let me double check the name because I'm terrible with names. I think I have it. No, not him. The original story. Bear with me. Wolfram van Eckerbach, is that right? Oh no, Christian Detroit. Christian Destroy is the first person to pick up this idea. He wrote a story called Parsifal, the Story of the Grail. When was that to get the date? It's written in Old French in the late 12th century. This is really this is where we get this idea of the Grail. And if you understand what he actually wrote, it dispels some of the rumors and myths that you've heard about the Grail since. Um, so in the story, you have this young man by the name of Parsifal, hence the name of the story, who wants to become a knight. He goes on this journey, and no, I don't play Fortnite. I'm not a big fan of online games. But Parsifal goes on this journey, eventually comes to the court of the Fisher King, and sees that the Fisher King's been wounded in the side with a spear. Traditionally, he was actually wounded with the spear of destiny, the same spear that wounded Christ. But he sees this great progression where they bring this plate into him, and a dove flies down, leaves a Eucharist on the plate. And he takes that, and he's not completely healed of his wound, but it refreshes him and allows him to live for another day. This happens every morning. Now, when he sees this happen, he's meant to ask a question, which is, whom does the Grail serve? The problem he has is that he had been told early in the story that he asked too many questions. So when he sees this whole event happen, he keeps his mouth shut, fails the quest, and King Pelham, aka the Fisher King, continues to be injured until later when the story progresses. Now, here's the thing. That plate that held the Eucharist, that's the Holy Grail. That is the oldest reference to the term Holy Grail in the literature. Um, and the term in question, because you'll see there's this whole speculation that because of course Holy Grail comes from French, that San Grial, which is Holy Grail, it was an error that it actually is supposed to be Sang Rial, which would be holy blood or royal blood. Specifically saying that supposedly it's actually this whole idea that the Grail is actually a metaphor for the bloodline of Christ. Um, but the actual French, the original language, the actual Old French used, the actual term used is San Gradalis. San in this case means holy, but Gridalis is a plate. Specifically, it's a plate that's used as part of a dinner where you're serving multiple courses. One of the courses is served on this plate. That's the original Holy Grail, ladies and gentlemen. It's a plate that held a Eucharist. It is not associated with the Last Supper. It's not given really any backstory. It's just this plate. It serves and presumably God, but not asking the question. The problem that comes in that Crichton de Troyes has never actually finished Parsifal, and other writers attempted to do so. Those other writers kept changing the form the Grail took. In some stories, it's a stone. In some stories, it's a cauldron. In some stories, it is of course a cup. And people started to associate it with the story of Christ. Um, but that's the big thing: is the Holy Grail was not originally an object of veneration by the church. It's really just a plot device in a bunch of stories about King Arthur. Um, the main power it's associated with in the most famous Arthurian story, which is of course the La Morte d'Arthur by Sir Thomas Malory, who's an interesting character in his own right, of course, is that it appears before Arthur at his Pentecost feast and feeds the entire table by miracle. And that's what launches the Grail quest. And all the knights go running off, and eventually Galahad finds it, among others. It's a whole thing outside the context of the story. Um, this should make it pretty clear that this whole idea of a holy bloodline of Christ existing from ancient time is a load of rubbish. Um, for those of you who remember and who might be wondering, Dan Brand originally got the idea from the Da Vinci Code from a book called Holy Blood, Holy Grail. Holy Blood, Holy Grail is what first proposed this idea of the bloodline of Christ being secret and protected down through history um, by various secret orders, including the Knights Templar yet again, and eventually in modern times a group called the Priori di Sion. Um, the Priori di Sion, funny enough, which is where the guy who founded that group is where the authors got a lot of their information. And what they didn't realize is the whole thing was a hoax. I mean, yes, he came up with this list of all these famous people throughout history that were supposed, like Leonardo da Vinci, who were supposedly members of the Priori de Sion. It is held in the National Library in France, and it's a known forgery. Um, there is no mention anywhere in Scripture of Jesus being married. Very, very importantly, usually you'll hear, "Oh, well, that was edited out." You'll find, and people talk about these other texts called the Gnostic Gospels. Um, so there are the Synoptic Gospels. There are four Gospels that are in the Bible: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But there's a whole host of other Gospels out there: Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Mary, and Mary his mother, Gospel of Judas, Gospel of Mary Magdalene, um, Gospel. I think there's Gospel of Philip. But at any rate, all these other Gospels that claim to tell the story of Christ's life, often from very different perspectives, and these have fascinated people a lot recently. But the first problem you run into is there's this idea that they secretly tell about how he's married. Nowhere in any of the Gnostic Gospels does it say Jesus was married. There is one point where it refers to Mary Magdalene as his cousin, and supposedly this was a popular euphemism at the time for being his wife. No, it wasn't. Um, Mary Magdalene was very important, but she wasn't married to Jesus. Another common misconception that goes with this is people have this idea that, well, Mary was much more important, but the early church fathers pushed her aside and tried to make her less important because they didn't want people to know the truth and they were misogynists. That's really not accurate if you study what the early church fathers had to say on the subject. Um, Augustine Aquinas, the other major early thinkers in the Origen, the other early major thinkers in the church, had a great deal of respect for Mary Magdalene. The Bible talks about how Jesus was the second Adam. The first Adam sinned and ruined it for the rest of us, so we need a new Adam to make up the sins of the first Adam. Some of the early church fathers, just as they said Jesus was the new Adam, said Magdalene was the new Eve. And it's not to make her less important that they turned her into a prostitute. It was to make her more important, because originally there's three Marys: Mary Magdalene, Mary Bethany, and another a prostitute simply named Mary that got conflated into the same person. And that's where this idea of they were trying to demonize her by making her a prostitute. Again, that's not what's actually going on. She's not as major of a character in the Gospels as Mary Magdalene herself, but by bringing the three of them together, she becomes more significant. Um, but again, no evidence they were married. One of the main arguments you'll hear for why Jesus had to be married is that supposedly rabbis at the time all had to be married. Now, it's true that in the first century, current era, most rabbis were expected to be married. But there's two reasons why this isn't applicable here. The first reason is that not all sects followed that rule. The Essenes, among others, actually not only were the rabbis not expected to be married, they weren't allowed to be married. Um, on the second thing of it, that rule applied to a formally trained rabbi, which Jesus was not. He's called rabbi all through the Gospels as an honorific, because he's rabbi means teacher. They're calling him teacher. They're using it as a form of respect. There's no evidence anywhere that he went through formal training and was recognized as a rabbi in the Jewish community at the time. At least in the formal sense of the word. It'd be like me saying I'm a priest, even though I've never actually been to seminary school. Is the closest analogy I can think of. Um, but there are, of course, other famous blessed objects. The veil of Veronica that was used to wipe Christ's face on the way to the crucifixion. The Shroud of Turin, we'll come back to that in a second. Uh, the Spear of Longinus, also known as the Spear of Destiny. Um, there's stories and a dubious amount of evidence that Adolf Hitler went looking for the Spear of Destiny. And it may be true. We certainly do know that Heinrich Himmler of the SS was obsessed with occultism and went looking for a whole bunch of occult artifacts. Hitler was not obsessed with the occult. He was very materialistic. Which is not to say he was an atheist. He certainly wrote extensively about his belief in God. If you're interested in my thoughts on his religious beliefs, there's a video Adolf Hitler's religious beliefs on the channel. Um, I don't think he was Christian. I don't agree that he was Christian. I also don't think he was an atheist. I think mostly Hitler was an extreme narcissist who worshipped himself and wanted other people to do so. Um, but back on point, there's some evidence he may have actually looked for and held one of four different, because this is another recurring theme with holy objects. Often you don't have one, you have multiple. There are four different spears that are supposed to be the spear that pierces the side of Christ, one of which even ups the ante by saying it has one of the three nails from the crucifixion worked into it. There's also a rumor that Joyous, the sword of Charlemagne, was the Spear of Destiny melted down and reworked into a sword. Um, and Joyous is still around. It's in a French museum, I want to say. Uh, is there any truth to any of it? I don't, I don't know. I do think there's possibly some credibility to the idea that Hitler went looking for the spear in a museum in Austria, which does contain one of the four alleged spears. Not so much because he thought it had any magical powers, but he might have gone looking for it as a symbol. Because people would have, whether he believed in it or not, he understood that people would attach special significance to it. Um, you don't have to believe something has power, to understand the symbolic value of it, obviously. And certainly it's possible that Heinrich Himmler with his group, the Harambe, that went running around the world looking for all sorts of bizarre proof of the idiotic racial beliefs of the Nazis. Um, may have tried to look for the spear and the Grail and anything else you can think of. Both Christian and non-Christian, because he got in again. He got into some strange ideas, but there are, of course, one of the most common things that is thought of as holy, is particularly within the Catholic Church, would be saints' relics, which are the various parts of dead saints. Um, it can be, and I've actually held in my hands, what they call a second class relic. Because first class relics are a bone, skin, some actual piece of a saint. There are second and third class relics. A second class relic is an item the saint owned. For example, I've specifically held in my hand a rosary that's one of among 30 rosaries that was used by the late, now Saint, achieved sainthood, Padre Pio. Um, I There's also third class relics, which are objects that have been touched by first class relics. It's a whole system. Um, some of them are real, some of them are probably real, some of them aren't. Um, some of them are rather interesting, just like there are bones in Turkey that are supposed to be the bones of Santa Claus, or more accurately, the bones of Saint Nicholas, who was one of the inspirations for Santa Claus. Should have a video on where Santa Claus, the idea of Santa Claus, comes from in our back videos as well. But yes, and then there's another set of bones. Part of his bones were stolen, and some of them may or may not have resurfaced later. So there are two sets of bones that are associated with Santa Claus circulating the world. Um, Another thing I think from the time of Christ that's worth discussing is probably the most famous relic associated with Christ, other than the Holy Grail, which would be the Shroud of Turin. Um, Most people listening to this probably know what the shroud is. If you don't, it is a funerary cloth that turned up in the Middle Ages that is supposedly the funerary cloth wrapped around Christ at his death, when he was laid in the tomb. And there's an image marked on the cloth of a man that resembles Christ, or at least resembles popular depiction, resembles what we think Christ looked like, marked with the wounds described in the Bible: the wounds in the hands, the wounds on the feet, the crown of thorns. But is this the actual Shroud of Turin? I hate to break this because there's a lot of people out there, and some of you may be listening, that believe otherwise. But I hate it to break it to people, but no, it's not. Um, Radiocarbon dating has been done on the shroud. It dates back to the Middle Ages. It's nowhere near old enough. Um, the counter is that, well, it was burned, and that can interfere with carbon dating. There is no evidence. One, there's no evidence of it being older than the Middle Ages. Two, and perhaps more significantly, the time period that it appeared in and the area it appeared in was particularly well known for producing fake artifacts. It is most likely a hoax. That doesn't mean that somewhere out there the real shroud that was wrapped around Christ doesn't exist. One of my favorite fantasy authors, Jim Butcher, proposed in the book Skin Game that the god Hades, the god of the dead from Greek mythology, collected the shroud and is currently holding it in a vault for various reasons. And the one circulating the world is in fact a hoax. Funny enough, with the further presumption of so many people believe in the fake shroud that it still might have some holy power in its own right, because given the nature and the power of belief. Um, I'm not certainly not saying that's true. It's a book of fiction. Jim Butcher doesn't claim it's anything other than a book of fiction. I just think it's a particularly interesting take on the whole situation. Um, my own experience. I mean, I've worked with relics before. The rosary from Padre Pio, certainly. I've seen they do have an effect. Um, Holy water, I can say for certain, is very effective when dealing with the demonic. Um, as could be holy oil and holy salt. There's also a whole other step to that, which is those things. Except instead of just being holy, they go through a rite of exorcism, and they're specifically intended for exorcisms and hospice things of that nature. I have a bottle of that in my bedroom. I bring with me on cases from the exorcist to help teach me what I know. The late great Father Joseph Bros. Um, but that's kind of the situation there. Let's see, what time is it? How much time do I have left? Um, I do see I have a couple of people listening in live. Anybody have any questions? Questions, comments, concerns? You want to laugh at me? Somewhere down the line, I'm going to try and set up Skype or something to that effect during the shows that people can actually call back in if you have want to ask a question on air. For the time being, that's among the many things that we can't do because of the fact we no longer have the studio. Um, we will still be broadcasting every week about still 6:30 to 7:30. I'm going to start trying to do other videos because I've been meaning to do those for a while. Anyway, um, I'm probably going to cut this short because if you can't tell, my voice is kind of going. Uh, I just wanted to get something up there. I'm trying to think if there's anything particularly related to curses we should have covered that we didn't. No, I can't think of anything. Okay, yeah, I'm afraid I was planning on going at least till 7:30, but again, you can hear it. My voice is going. I'm also sleep deprived. I haven't had as much as I should in the last few days. Uh, but this is the new format for the channel. For the foreseeable future, we do have the potential to go back to doing shows on the radio, but I'll be blunt, we need financial help to do that. If you want to help out the show, if you have money, you can go to patreon.com slash demonology, patreon.com slash, no, wait, no, I'm sorry, patreon.com slash, yeah, demonology. Link will be in the description. Um, if you want to, if that doesn't work for you, you can email me. Email is in the description as well. We can work something, a PayPal or something else to that effect out. Um, we need probably $300 or more a month to go back to radio, just to give you an idea of where that is. Um, if you don't have any money, I'm working on trying to work out sponsors again. In the meantime, the most helpful thing anybody can do, other than donate, is like, comment, subscribe, share this with your friends. Encourage them to like, comment, and subscribe. And you know what? If you don't like it, feel free to put a dislike down, and tell me what you think I said that was wrong. Um, I am open to constructive criticism. I'm open. I've had for a long time. I've been doing this 4 years. For a long time, I had a policy of abusive comments. I delete them. Um, I'm not doing that anymore. If you can, if as long as you can keep um vulgarity and what's the other problem? Hate speech, slurs in particular, out of your comments, I'll let them stand. Even if you don't agree, even if you don't like me, even all you want to do is say I'm fat. If you say I'm fat, I'll say thanks for the metrics. Because here's the thing: even if it's negative, that all that stuff helps boost me in the various algorithms that YouTube uses. Um, so I don't really mind. I want to again say I do recommend checking out Mr. Atheist's videos about this utter insanity is Make America Straight Again. Um, Cyrus the Skeptic's done some videos about it too. Just about everyone else in the atheist community has done it. And here's another thing I want to say, and this is a message in particular to my Christian listeners. Those of you who agree with me, who think that the actively, openly, directly calling for acts of violence against the LGBT community Whether that whether that act of violence is on a person level or on a governmental level, that you're saying the government should round these people up and execute them, that cops should shoot them in the streets. If you think this is wrong and immoral, I strongly encourage you to speak up. There's an old saying, the only thing needed for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. Don't do nothing. You have a voice, use it. And this goes for everybody, not just Christians. If you see something going on, and this is also why I'm still harping about this subject. If you see something going on you know to be wrong, you have a moral obligation to stand up and go no. Um, and then me M says the Holy Grail is an allegory, not to be taken literally as a physical object. The Holy Grail is inside you. I would agree that it's an allegory. I'm not sure that the Grail is inside you. I would argue instead that the Grail, and particularly the Grail quest, because usually in the various stories of the Grail, it's a quest. It's undertaken by Galahad. It's undertaken by Parzival. Heck, it's taken by the entire Round Table. I would argue that it's an allegory of the spiritual journey everyone takes in reaching a deeper relationship with God. Um, that's my personal opinion on the subject. I am certainly not saying I'm right or wrong. Ma'am, your comments not new to me, but I do find it an interesting take on the subject. And other people have done videos and things of that nature. Um, and certainly I agree that yeah, it's an allegory. It's not real. And I think this actually I got a little more wind in me. And this is a related topic that I want to touch on briefly. That was originally going to be my next video in the soapbox series. Um, and it probably will be a future video in that series. But I'm going to touch on it real quickly. Um, Christian, Christian movie making is a mess. If you guys have seen the God's Not Dead series or just about everything else produced by Pureflix, you can see what I mean. The movies are bad. The acting is bad. The story is non-existent. The movies are, and the people who created the movies say this is what they're intended to be, sermons. And they fail completely. And it's frustrating. Good Christian fiction exists. You know, Charlton Heston's Ten Commandments is pretty positively looked upon. C.S. Lewis's The Screwtape Letters and the Chronicles of Narnia, Christian fiction, highly respected. And Miam adds the quest is raising your Kundalini. I respectfully disagree. Um, because I'm Christian, that just doesn't fit. I'm not a big believer in the Kundalini thing. Although if that's how you choose to interpret it, more power to you. I disagree. I'm not saying you're wrong. Two different concepts. But at any rate, to get on point and how this relates to Miam's point about the Grail being an allegory. Because here's another big example of good Christian fiction. Middle Ages is full of it. If you want to make a good Christian movie, or good Christian music, or good Christian art of any kind, you have to tell a story. It's fine to have a message you want to get across. It's fine to be allegory. C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia are unapologetically allegory. While I generally agree with J.R.R. Tolkien's point about mistrusting allegory, you can make a good story and have it be allegorical. But you can't forget the message for the sake of story if you're trying to if there's a message to your movie, but you can't forget the story for the sake of message. If your goal in making in making a Christian movie, is to get people to think, get people to talk about it, and put butts in seats, and potentially convert people to your cause, you need to get their attention. And Christian movies aren't doing that. They're boring people. They're putting non-Christians to sleep. They're putting Christians to sleep. And it's wasting an opportunity. They're just making bad movies. When you could be making good movies and still getting your point across. Look at Lewis. Look at the writings of the Middle Age, the various epics and things like that of the Middle Ages. Um, there are, one of the greatest poems, widely considered two of the greatest poems ever written. Paradise Lost by John Milton and The Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri. Both have deeply spiritual Christian related symbolism. But they tell a story, and they're respected for the fact they told a good story. And if you want the most obvious example of my point, that you can you can tell a good story and still get a message across. Pick up your Bible. Jesus taught in using parable. He understood the power of story. And this is another thing people regularly underestimate. Story has a great deal of power to it, all by itself. How many people have fought, suffered, and died for the story of Jesus Christ? Whether you think Jesus Christ was an actual historical person or not, the story of him has had enormous power for nearly 2,000 years since he's believed to have died. Another example, people have been inspired by the story of King Arthur, who hasn't existed in 1,500 years, may never have existed at all, and for heaven's sakes, if he did exist, he's completely different than people are envisioning him. Kids go to see movies and they get inspired. There are people working in science and technology at NASA. They got interested in those things by watching Star Trek and Star Wars as children. There are people that grew up wanting to be cops because of Police Academy, funny enough, or Die Hard, or Sherlock Holmes when they were kids. Stories can inspire people. Stories can hook the imagination. And stories can teach a moral lesson. But you have to tell a good story. A good story makes or breaks a movie. There's a reason why God's Not Dead, 1, 2, or 3, they're up to at least 3 now, maybe more, was blasted by critics, Christian and non-Christian critics. But Prince of Egypt, which I talked about earlier, is still highly regarded years later. The Ten Commandments, many years since that came out, still highly regarded by non-Christians because they remembered to tell the story. That's going to do it for tonight. I want to thank everybody for listening in. I hope you enjoyed this. I'm sorry for my voice getting all cracky at the end. Remember, like, comment, subscribe, and share. Have a good night, everyone, and God bless.